Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Rare Petro Podcast. Today we have episode 3 of the Industry Leader Spotlight, and today I am joined by my guest, Mr. Timothy Marquez. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Marquez.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Of course. Timothy Marquez is a Colorado School of Mines alumnus in petroleum engineering and was the founder and CEO of Beneco Incorporated. His insight navigating the oil and gas landscape in multiple price environments applies to the industry today. Now a retired oil and gas professional, Tim has been involved in supporting education in Colorado through donations to Denver public schools and a grant to mines for the Marquez Hall Petroleum Building, which opened in 2012. Now, without any more hesitation, let's try and get into the questions. Everybody has an origin story in oil and gas. How exactly did you get into the oil and gas industry?
You know, a lot of the things that have happened to me have happened just by luck, or it's kind of funny. So the way I got into petroleum is I went to Colorado School of Mines. I had a strong math and science background, and Golden's just down the road from where I grew up in Denver, and I liked the size of the school. I'd also looked at CU, but I didn't get a warm fuzzy there, and fortunately for me, I didn't know how tough Mines was going to be. And I know we all share that. So I went to Mines, and at my first year, I didn't even know what an engineer was, but I saw this metallurgical engineer, and I go, God, that sounds cool. A metallurgical engineer. I had no idea what it was, but it sounded cool. So anyway, I declared myself as a metallurgical engineer. But after my freshman year, my good friends, most of which I'd gone to high school with in Southwest Denver, they got jobs in the oil industry, in field hands, and they made a ton of money. And I didn't have any money, and I saw how much they made, and that's what prompted me to change into petroleum. So I changed when I was a sophomore and worked the following summer. So total accidental that I became a petroleum engineer.
Well, I gotta say, money is a fantastic incentive, and I think I'd be lying if I neglected to say that played into my decision just a little bit as well. But it sounds like it definitely put you on track. When would you say that in the industry you took a leadership role that really broke away from the rest of the path and established itself?
Well, when I got out of school, I worked for a large oil company, a major oil company. It's no longer in existence. It was Union Oil Company, later became Unocal, and then later merged with Chevron. And I worked there about 12 years at Unocal, initially in California, and then I got transferred to Europe, where I worked in the Netherlands, England, and then later Scotland. And the longer I worked for this particular large company, Unocal, the more disenchanted I became. I just felt like, the company didn't have a vision. They didn't treat people well. They did a lot of things I just didn't like. It wasn't a bad company. It's probably no better or worse than most of the other majors. I think just working for a big company just wasn't my thing. It was great training ground. Working overseas kind of brought me out of my shell. I'm a somewhat introverted person, but when you're all of a sudden thrown in Europe, a bunch of different cultures and all that, all of a sudden, you have to kind of blossom to exist. And so in 1992, 12 years after starting Unocal did what I consider a very dumb thing. They wanted to cut back the labor force, which is fine, but if it's your company or my company, if you want to cut back your labor force, you are going to take your poor performing employees and get rid of them. Unocal just said, you know what, we want to reduce our workforce by 10%, and anybody who wants to go can go. And so I was first in line, because I had been thinking about starting my own oil company. I talked with a couple people about doing that. And when they said, well, we'll pay you to leave, I was first in line. So the first couple years was tough. I started with no money. I started my oil company at $5,000. not 5 million or 5 billion. I started $5,000, which, as you can imagine, even back then, that didn't go very far. Although I negotiated I knew that Unical had an empty office in a little city south of Santa Barbara called Carpinteria, and I knew it was sitting there, and so I said, I'll take that off your hands. He said, well, just throw us some, you have to give us a little cash. And I said, how about $70, $75? He said, okay. So I had a full office with, utilities, everything for $75. But even so, it was tough. And it took almost 2 years, almost exactly 2 years before I acquired my first property. And I paid the grand total of ended up being about $115,000, which doesn't sound like much money, but when you have $5,000 in the bank, it might as well have been $115 billion. But eventually, I was able to raid my 401k. I had a college fund for my little kid that we had started. Didn't even have much, but a couple $1,000s. I put money on credit card. I borrowed a little bit of money from my parents. They didn't have much money. It's not like I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth. My dad was a school teacher, but I borrowed $10,000 from him. My wife borrowed $10,000 from her mom, and we just cobbled together enough money to barely close the deal. And then after that, it was off to the races. We took that little field and increased production and decreased expenses, and took a property that was just breaking even to within a year we had it cash flowing about $200,000 a month. That's about 2.4 million a year, and that allowed us to acquire another property. Did the same thing there, turned that field around, and then 2 years out. So we closed our first deal April 1st, 1994, and 2 years, 1 year after that, exactly on April 1st, 1995, we closed our third acquisition, the Beverly Hills field, which gave us critical mass. And the critical mass allowed us to establish a banking relationship with a large or a medium-sized Texas bank that no longer exists. They merged with Wells Fargo. But we had, for the first time, we had excess credit capacity. So I think we had a $13 million borrowing base. Borrowing base is basically how much they'll allow you to draw. And we only had, at that time, probably about $4 million in debt. So we had $9 million. Just I could write a check out to do anything. And so then we just used that to really leverage things up. And from there, it was off to the races. So long-winded way of answering your question. I think Beneco started to become prominent probably when we got our first offshore property. A couple years after that, the South Elwood field off of Santa Barbara, and that was it was a great field that we bought it for a song and a dance. That I think we paid $16 million for it. And at one time when oil prices were very high, I think the 2P value, the proven probable value on that was discounted 10%, about $2 billion. So that $15 million did a lot of good for that acquisition. So I think that's when we started to become seen as being a real player. Certainly in California, we were getting people's attention. People knew who Beneco was. Prior to that, I couldn't get in the front door of a bank or an oil company. But after that, after people saw, when people see that you have a platform, an oil platform, it somehow makes you more real, even though, the reserves are what you're valued at. But when people see a physical platform, the bankers see it, they go, wow, you guys are real. So I guess that's when we started to become a more prominent company, is late 90s.
Certainly a strong start, but were there any hurdles that got in the way? Was there anything that really limited Beneco from becoming what you felt was its max potential, or was it pretty easy along the whole way?
It's funny. I don't think there's an entrepreneur in the world who hasn't had major speed bumps, not little ones. My first big speed bump after, having to raise that $115,000, which at the time was formidable. But the next one was Enron became an investor on my 40th birthday to the day. So on June 29th, 1998, Enron invested $60 million into our company and acquired about a 30% interest in the company. It's hard to imagine back in those days, but Enron was the good housekeeping seal of approval. They were it. If Enron invested in your company, you were labeled as an up and coming company, and it was one of Enron's biggest investments in the oil industry at the time, and everything seemed great. Well, right after Enron put their money in, oil prices declined. They declined, and they declined some more. So at the end of 98, early 99, we had one field, the South Elwood field, offshore field. I think the lowest the oil price ever hit there, it was $3 or $4 a barrel. You know, think of that, 10 cents a gallon. What can you buy for 10 cents a gallon? And it was the industry, you know, certainly people new to the industry now, I think one of the words I think we talked about via email was that these are unprecedented times we're in now. I guess with regards to coronavirus, it's unprecedented, but I've lived through two worse oil price downturns than going on right now. So in 1998, 99, kind of that winter, when our local oil price down, you know, $3 or $4 a barrel, that was tough. But we actually thrived during that period. We, you know, the old saying, buy low, sell high. Our company always did the best when oil prices were low, because when everybody else was panicking, that's when we would come in and strike a good deal. And sure enough, in early 99, we bought a total of 5 platforms from Chevron and paid $6 million for it. And as oil price rebounded, our first full year of cash flow after 99, so in the year 2000, those properties cash flowed about $45 million. So, you know, we were really good about not panicking when oil prices were low. And so we survived the low price downturn, continued to grow. We were the fastest growing oil company in the country 2 years in a row. Everything was great until 2002. 2002, Enron started having major problems, and maybe a little bit before, at least some of your time, but in 2002, actually it's 2001, Enron started having financial problems, and all of a sudden I feel like I'm dealing with the mafia. The 2 vice presidents come to Santa Barbara and meet with me, and all of a sudden these guys who had formerly been nice are not so nice now, and they're demanding that we pay them off even though we had no obligation to do so. And they made us a dumb proposal, and I told them this is a dumb proposal, which it was. And that commenced a battle for control of Veneco. So Enron wanted to figure out a way to force Veneco to either buy them out or liquidate. And if Veneco liquidated, then they would be paid off. But so what they did is, roughly at that point in time, I owned a third of the company. I had 2 partners that owned a third, and Enron owned roughly a third. But nobody had control. I was CEO, and you know, I thought everything was great. Well, unbeknownst to me, my 2 partners got together with Enron. They were later found guilty in a Delaware court of breaching their fiduciary duty as directors. Not that ended up doing me a lot of good, but they got together, Enron and my 2 partners, and voted me out of my own company in 2002. And talking about being shocked, you know, one minute you have the fastest growing oil company in the United States, and then everything's going great with the company. We're growing by leaps and bounds. We're up to, you know, 18, 20,000 net barrels a day. We're, you know, in terms of oil reserves, I think we're probably about 15th biggest company in the country at that point in time. And then all of a sudden I'm voted out of my own company. And with Enron, they were just trying to get cash, although, you know, the Veneco investment, you know, Enron ended up being, I don't know, $35 billion in debt or something like that. It certainly wasn't going to solve their problems, but they were trying to get as much cash as they could. My other partners, the principal guy was a guy that really was pretty worthless, as I came to find out. I didn't know him before I started my company. We'd been introduced to each other, and I didn't really know him, but it seemed like things were going well. We were all making more money than we ever dreamed, and the company's growing, everything's good, but it was the ego factor. The number 2 guy wanted to be the number 1 guy. So anyway, they voted me out of my company in 2002, and all of a sudden I'm feeling pretty stupid. I feel, trying to remove the knife from my back. But I didn't whine or cry about it. What I did is I started a second oil company. I started Marquez Energy. I moved to Denver, started Marquez Energy, and that company took off. And keep in mind, all my assets are tied up in Veneco. It was a private company, so on paper I was worth a ton of money. I mean, at that point in time, I was probably worth, I don't know, 50, 60, $70 million, something like that. But I couldn't buy a cup of coffee with, stock in a private company. You can't borrow against it. You can't do much with stock in a private company. So I started my new company again without very much cash, and we took off like a rocket as well. In the meantime, I had 2 lawsuits against the board of directors of my former company. And after 2 long years, I prevailed, and I first bought out my partners really cheap. And then once I had their shares, then I was able to change the board, put myself in as CEO, and then I go to Enron and go, I'm back. And it was pretty funny because they did not see that company. They thought the partners hated each other so much. In fact, they told my lawyer, they said, these guys hate each other so much, so they won't even enter the same room. Yes, I did hate them, but I'm still a businessman. And by buying them out, I could see, this is the end of the game. And so I bought out my partners, bought out Enron at the end of 2004. And all of a sudden I had 100% ownership in Veneco. And also at that same time, oil prices started to really take off. So yeah, anybody who's ever started a company, I don't know of anybody I've ever met, an entrepreneur that didn't have dark days. It just kind of comes with it. Anybody who thinks you have a company and it's all fun and roses and unicorns and all that, that's just, maybe it happens once in a while, but it certainly didn't happen to me.
Oh, I definitely understand that. But it certainly seems like you worked every possible angle of Veneco. From starting the business to owning it privately, to going public, to being voted out, coming back and owning it again. Do you have a preference in the arena of private versus public? What are the advantages? Which one do you prefer?
Yeah, so in 2006, we went public. And one of the main reasons I want to go public is, I didn't start a company to make a bunch of money. I know that probably sounds funny, but I want to just do things the right way. But once Veneco started becoming worth a lot of money, by the time we went public, I think my shares were probably worth $600 million, something like that. I wanted to do something with that money. To me, one of the dumbest things is you make a ton of money is to just sit on it and hoard it. To me, that's pointless. So we all need a certain amount of money to live on. Beyond that, it's play money, right? And so I over the years, I've become very philanthropic, both my wife and I. And by going public, I was able to do something with those shares. Because again, a private company, it's really hard to do much financially with those shares. You either ultimately sell the company or go public, and I chose to go public. And first thing I did is I donated $100 million. $50 million went to the Denver Scholarship Foundation to send kind of unloved kids to the college. So it's the kids kind of at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of the grade. Kids have financial need. And having been one of those kids growing up in Southwest Denver, I went to one of the worst high schools in Denver. Those kids were near and dear to my heart. So started that up, and then we started our own foundation. So to answer your question, I mean, I needed to go public or sell the company off to be able to do what I, really kind of moved my heart. But of course, being public is, it's a tough business. You're dealing with analysts all the time and the changing wants and needs of investors. When we went public, most companies like ourselves, acquisition and development company, We acquire existing properties and we develop them, but we don't do any exploration to speak of in a very small amount. We were valued at 7 times cash flow, and that math worked for me. You could buy back then a property for 4 or 5 times cash flow, and you put it into a company and it's worth 7 times cash flow, and works well. Well, that was about the time shortly after we went public that all the shale producers started taking off like a rocket. These companies growing 40, 50% a year. It's high risk, high reward kind of stuff. Everything worked well at, $100 oil and $10 gas, or $8 or $10 gas. And all of a sudden, the public market they weren't showing us the love. We all of a sudden, even though we kept growing, the value the company came down, and we were trading down 3.5, 4 times cash flow. And now all of a sudden, you're trying to buy an oil property at 5 or 6 times cash flow, but it's only being valued in your own company at 4 times. And clearly, since we all went to school mines, we can all understand that math doesn't work at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I took the company private at that point in time, and which was an ordeal. And I'm the only one who's ever been able in the last 30 years that I know of to take an oil company from public to private. It's an ordeal. There's automatic lawsuits. It's not a fun process to go through, but nevertheless, we did it, and that's the point when I retired. Only to see the company eventually disappear when we had a pipeline that we sold. About 60 or 70% of our production went through one pipeline in California, and that company, Plains All American, had the worst operated pipeline in the history of the oil industry. They ended up finding that 70 miles of that pipeline had to be condemned because it was just Swiss cheese. And that was the end of our company. One day everything's great, oil prices are high. Next day there's a leak, pipeline shut in, and our biggest fields are all, one day they're worth $1.5 billion or so, proven value. Next day they're worth 0. But easy come, easy go.
Oh, most definitely. Earlier, you did mention, though, that you feel maybe the word unprecedented is being tossed around just a little too much. While it is certainly a significant situation, although you wouldn't call it unprecedented, what do you make of prices in the negative territory and storage bursting at the seams? Why perhaps is this different but not as bad as the other downturns you've seen?
Well, just in the scale, first of all, those negative prices, that was a financial thing. I don't think the day that, they reported that oil was negative 40, or I don't know, whatever, $40 a barrel. That was about the lowest I saw oil price go. And I looked in California, and they didn't go below $18, $17, $18 a barrel, something like that. So having been my own company at times when we were down at $3 a barrel, $3.50 a barrel. And that lasted, that downturn lasted a couple of years, several years. I think it lasted roughly from 98, 99, started creeping back up, but they didn't really take off until 2003 or 4. I think this right now feels really bad. We're into this 2 months so far. None of us know where oil price is going to take off. And it looks to me like oil price is going to bounce back to, $40 a barrel by early next year. So in the big scheme of things, it feels horrible right now. And there's no doubt there's bankruptcy. There's all kinds of bad stuff going on. But I don't think it's going to be as deep or as long lasting as some of the previous ones. The other downturn I'd been was in 1986. When prior to that, oil price had really taken off, oil embargoes and so on and so forth, gone up to $35, $36 a barrel. And then all of a sudden it crashed and went down to $9 or $10 a barrel. And that downturn lasted from 86 until probably about 1994 or 5. That's about when oil price finally took off. So that lasted 7, 8 years. And it was dismal time to be in the industry. And a lot of people talk about it being the end of the oil industry. And that was a tough time. Now, I was working for a big company, so I was sheltered in large part from that. I didn't lose my job. And so in that sense, for an employee, it probably wasn't as bad. It was bad if you're an independent, but if you're with a major oil company, it wasn't so bad. I mean, independents are always going to get, the best of the good times and the worst of the bad times. Certainly right now, the industry's in chaos. Oil prices are low. Probably the bigger problem right now is all the private equity that fuels the oil industry is fleeing the industry. That everybody got so burned. All these, I think, idiots, these financial idiots from New York who started investing in the oil industry when oil's up to $100 a barrel. I mean, to me, that was idiotic, right? You buy low, sell high. You don't want to invest at the peak of the market, but there were tens of billions of dollars put in, and almost, I would guess 90% of that money was lost. And so it's going to take a long time, I think, for the oil industry people to get comfortable putting back in that kind of money. And it was an unhealthy amount of money. There's too much equity being put into the oil industry, and but that's the whole oil industry. It swings from super good times to super bad times. It doesn't ever seem like there's middle of the ground. It'd be nice if we went 5 years at $50 a barrel rather than $110 a barrel one day and then down to 18 a couple of years later. So yeah, I wouldn't. It's certainly not unprecedented. And then before my career, if you ever read any oil history, it's just the nature of our industry. It's when oil prices get high, we start producing a lot of oil, a lot of investments made. Gets production too high, production gets too high, causes a drop in oil prices, and such massive swings. We don't have. A lot of people think there's this big cartel and the majors, control the world and all that. Well, if that's the case, they don't do a very good job because it's, none of this is good for anybody.
No, of course not. You briefly touched on it a little bit earlier, but you mentioned there's going to be a significant amount of bankruptcies. Obviously, people are going to struggle. Do you think anything will come out of this downturn? Any new standards, any new practices? Or will it be mainly inconsequential by the time we reach the end?
Well, the good thing about these downturns is it always drives innovation and efficiencies. I mean, I don't follow the oil industry as closely as I used to, obviously, because I've been retired now quite a few years. But I do see that people are driving down the cost of drilling. They're getting more efficiency with these multi-stage fracs. So it's definitely going to lead to efficiencies and almost certainly going to lead to innovation. It's the innovation, the shale revolution, both oil and gas, has been. To me, it's unbelievable what's happened. That people can drill 10,000-foot laterals. I don't know, 50 stage, I don't know, 100 stage, probably 5,000 stage fracs by now. I don't know what they're doing, and do it in a safe manner. Now we don't get any credit for doing it in a safe manner in the public's eye, but I think the good thing of this is it's almost certainly going to drive innovation and efficiencies. It's going to weed out the Johnny-come-latelys. When oil prices get high, there's always the Johnny-come-latelies that want to jump in the industry, and a lot of its employees, a lot of its investors, and it has a good way of weeding out people that shouldn't have been in the industry in the first place. I mean, it's tough to go through it, but I'll tell you one thing about our industry is I've certainly learned it well, is if you can survive the tough times, there will be good times ahead. I can't remember which one of you has just got out of school. It's not fun getting out of school right now. I don't think there's hundreds of job offers right now, to say the least. But for people, a lot of friends, back in '86 when I was a young engineer, a lot of people got laid off. Some went back and got an advanced degree. Some people took jobs in the field, and but all those guys that lost their jobs, they all bounced back. Nobody died. It's tough. It wasn't fun. And when you're in the middle of a downturn, I think one of the toughest parts, it feels like it's going to go on forever. I mean, we're into this downturn right now for 3 months, but it feels like 3 years, and it feels like it's going to be another, 3 years. But it won't. I mean, the solution to low oil prices is low oil prices. So when prices are low, people stop drilling, production goes down, oil prices go up. So, there is light at the end of the tunnel. I know it doesn't feel good now if you don't have a job. But the thing to do for anybody who's lost their job is don't give up hope. Stay in the industry. Do whatever you can. I mean, it means you have to go take a restaurant, good job. You got to work construction. I mean, I knew people who did all that. And, when I started my company, I had 2 years without any income, with zero income. And, my wife and I figured out a way to survive that. So, it's all solvable. That's, what being an engineer is about is you take, okay, these are the conditions I have. How do I solve this problem? And hopefully, at mine, we've got some good engineers there. I hope people, believe in themselves.
That's definitely something I like to hear. It's a refreshing take, as a lot of people have a lot of negativity going on, considering you see just low prices, bad posts on LinkedIn about people losing their jobs. But I agree, it will probably feel a little bit better once I do land myself a position, being 3 weeks out of school. But on a broader scale, rather than individuals, let's say today you come out of retirement, you're working for a company, private, public, whatever. What advice would you give to these companies, or what would you personally do to try and navigate these waters and minimize financial risk?
Well, I'll tell you, going back to, I touched on it briefly before, is we always had our best success in times like this. Times like this, there's companies that will panic. They think oil is going to be $20 a barrel forever. You can strike really good deals right now. In fact, I mentioned briefly that I bought those 5 platforms from Chevron for $6 million. What I didn't tell you is, that was at the bottom of the market, and our borrowing base, our ability to borrow dropped, and I had to go back to Chevron and renegotiate the deal. So rather than give up on the deal and say I don't have $6 million, I went back to Chevron and said, look, I'd like to structure this. I'll still give you the $6 million, but I can give you $2 million now, and I'll give you $2 million next year and $2 million the following year. And keep in mind, that's the property that the first full year we had it, we made about $50 million on that thing. So right now, I in some ways, I'd love to be back in the industry because I know I could get good deals right now. There's people who have too much leverage. A lot of people just flat out give up. They think it's too hard for them. And I think that's one of my strengths is I have as much tenacity as anybody out there. And, when I get thrown a curveball, I don't whine about it. I just say, okay, how am I gonna make this thing work? And I think right now the smart people are going, this is a really good time right now. I can make deals. You may have to structure the deals. There's always an art to that, but there's a lot of companies. The bigger companies are going to want to be shedding their fields with $20 operating expenses. That always happens, and smart guys from mines and other good engineering schools can take those existing fields, put little 10 or 11 carries, and cut expenses. Our first field we got, the way we really made money is I just put better pumps in the well, different type of pump. And it wasn't a high-tech stuff, but I just knew there was a better way to lift those wells. I guarantee there's 100 fields out there, probably 500 fields that the smart guy can go in and really create a lot of value. And then when oil prices come back up, then it's just going to enhance it even more. So this is actually a really good time for people who are tough-minded to do it. Anybody can make money at $100 a barrel. It's a lot harder to make money at this time, but on the other hand, it's a great time. It's a great time to be getting into the industry or trying to build a company.
So, in terms of advice you would give to up and coming entrepreneurs positioning themselves to start a business with these depressed prices, you would pretty much say strike while the iron's hot and try to make the best of a bad situation?
Exactly. You know what? The one thing I wasn't afraid to do is I wasn't afraid to pick up the phone and call people all day long. And, 95% of the time, people are either they don't want to sell or they're not serious about it or they're unrealistic. A guy thinks this field's worth $30 million when it's really worth $5. And he'll sit there and tell you, yeah, well, when oil price is $100 a barrel, this thing was worth, $35 million. And they go, well, that's nice, but it's now $20 a barrel. So, but I think a lot of people in the oil industry are unrealistic, but 5 or 10% of the time, you'll find somebody who said, you know what, I've had my company for years, I'm ready to quit, or I need to sell. The bigger companies, like I said, they always sell at times like these to get rid of their low margin properties, the ones with the high operating expenses. And there's deals to be had. I guarantee there's smart people out there right now that are cutting deals as we speak, while the other 90% are whining. The 10% people, the smart guys, are making money right now.
And you kind of talked about people who had been laid off, what they can do to try to get through these times. But what about the case of people kind of like myself who graduated this year, were excited to breach into the industry, and finding that it's just a little bit more difficult right now? What advice do you have that they can start with today to begin to differentiate themselves as candidates or even get a foot in the door somewhere? What can we do?
Well, I think, if possible, take any kind of job, whether it's with a service company, whether it's working in the field. The hardest thing for an oil company, once you get any size, is getting good employees. And I'll tell you what, if somebody had come to me and said, look, I'm willing to work in the field, I'm willing to work at reduced rate, I'm willing to intern at $10 an hour with the idea that, when prices bounce back, I'll prove to you I'm worth the money. That's the kind of guy I would love to hire, absolutely love to hire. So I think the thing to do is the main thing is don't give up hope. Just believe in the long term. Yeah, it sucks now you don't have enough money to even get a beer, but just do something, right? And try and stay in the industry. There's absolutely nothing wrong with working in the field. The 2 summers I worked in the field was very important to me because I got to see what actually happens in the field. I could understand the perspective of the guy in the field who's ignored by the engineers and geologists and management. So I think the thing to do is don't give up. Take any job you can. Like I said, wait tables at night, and even if you have to go to some company and say, look, give me 3 months. I'll work for free for 3 months. It's just to prove my value. And if I haven't proved it, then don't hire me. But there are people right now that would want to find people with good work ethics, people willing to work hard. Because the management at the companies, they know they're going to need people. There's not a company out there. Yes, they may have to make some short-term layoffs, but in the long term, they know they're going to need more employees. So I think there's probably some independents that will be willing to hire somebody on a structured basis. You might have to work in the field. You might have to work for a service company. But the thing is, keep trying. Don't give up. And if you have to take a job as a waiter or go into construction, our governor, our former governor Hickenlooper, got laid off in '86, and he didn't sit there and whine and cry. I mean, he got out of the industry, but he became a restaurateur and ended up going down a different path. But there's a lot of doors there. It's just I know it doesn't feel good. I understand. I get it. I had my back to the wall when oil prices were $4 a barrel in 1999. I'll tell you, it didn't feel good at all. And I was wondering, week to week, how long I could tough it out. But we kept, trying to figure out ways to cut expenses. And, all the management and engineers all had to take a cut in pay to minimize the layoffs. We didn't have to lay off some people, but there are opportunities out there. There always are.
Love to hear that, and I think it's definitely empowering wisdom that a lot of people my year, and even maybe a couple years before, needed to hear. So again, Mr. Marquez, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today. I think we've about fully picked your brain for everything we were interested in, but are there any organizations you would like to take this time to promote?
Well, of course, I'm a big fan. I've started 2 nonprofits here in Denver. One is the Denver Scholarship Foundation, and it does provide. We don't provide scholarships. The Denver Scholarship Foundation for the straight A students. We provide scholarships for those that for whatever reason their grades aren't as high, or they did. A lot of them have pretty good grades, but they don't have financial resources to go to college. So the Denver Scholarship Foundation is an amazing organization. So I guess that'd be the one. The other thing, of course, to help out is, the people who, the have-nots right now, the people out of jobs, food bank, Red Cross, any service like that, they all need money. There's a lot of people, as bad as it feels for you guys, imagine if you don't have a degree of any kind. Some people, I think it'll be years before they get back to a real job. A lot of restaurants I don't see the restaurant business coming back in full force anytime soon. I mean, maybe at best it gets back to 50% of capacity. I don't know, but anything like that, there's a lot of people hurting right now. So any of those organizations would be great. And the last thing I'd say, also going back to the thing, is work harder than the next guy. There's always a place for that guy who works harder. And right now, the place to work hard is the guy who contacts 30 companies going to do better than the guy who contacts 20. The guy who contacts 20 is going to do better than the guy who only contacts 10. Things don't happen by luck. It's hard work. And the guy who applies 40 different companies and figures out an angle, like I said, maybe you propose you work for half price or something. The guy who's clever and harder work and more tenacious, that's the one that's going to survive.
All right, Mr. Marquez, thanks again for taking the time to speak with us. You provided a lot of great wisdom and insight. Until we see you next time, everybody, please take care.